Okay, thank you. Well, this talk is quite a simple, straightforward one, simply explaining the Irish electoral system, and it's something that certainly the elected politicians will know already pretty well from first-hand experience, but I'll just run through some of the background to it. So, PRSTV, everyone knows, is the electoral system. Deconstructing that a little bit, PR, proportional representation, and proportional representation is a principle rather than a method. There are lots of ways in which we can achieve the proportional representation. What the principle means, pretty obviously, is that, broadly speaking, parties end up with more or less the same share of the seats as they won of the votes, or even more broadly, that people are represented, groups are represented in rough proportion to their strength in the population. And that principle can be implemented by many different methods. After I've finished, David Farrell will be talking about other methods of electing a parliament. And as you'll see then, if you don't already know, there are lots of different means by which the broad principle of proportional representation can be implemented. So PRSTV is one specific means of achieving the implementation of this principle. STV, of course, stands for the single transferable vote. Single transferable vote, meaning everyone has just one vote, and that vote can be, as people will know if they ever watched a counting process, can be transferred from one candidate to another as the count proceeds, according to the directions given by the voter. The voter gives directions on the ballot paper as to what they want to happen to their vote. So that's where PRSTV comes from, that's where the term comes from. Proportional representation is the principle. STV is one specific means of achieving that. Constituencies that we need to implement PRSTV, well, these have to be multi-member constituencies, because in any proportional representation system, the idea of proportionality requires that we share seats out among parties or groups in proportion to their strength. So we have to have more than one to share out in the first place. If there's just one seat per constituency, it can't be PR. So some people might have heard the phrase, which I mention only to instantly delete it from the record, the phrase PR in single-member constituencies, which people sometimes think, isn't that the way we elect a president or have a by-election? But no, it's not. That's a single transferable vote in single-member constituencies, which is an electoral system in its own right called the alternative vote, which David Farrell will be saying more about, but it's not PR. If there's just one MP per constituency, then it's not PR. And generally speaking, this is a rule, the more TDs there are per constituency, the more MPs per constituency, the more proportional the outcome nationally. This is kind of iron law that academics have discovered about electoral systems. The more MPs elected from each constituency, the more proportional the outcome nationally. In this country, constituency size in terms of the number of TDs elected per constituency is very small by international standards. All constituencies these days, as has been the case ever since 1948, return just 3, 4, or 5 TDs. Before 1948, there were constituencies returning 7, 8, even 9. Galway, the whole of County Galway was a 9-seater for the first 10 years of the state. So because of the way in which STV is implemented in this country, national outcomes might not be very proportional. There's absolutely no reason, either in practice or under the Constitution, why constituencies should not be larger than that, why they shouldn't all return 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 TDs. And if that were the case, that would deliver more proportional results. The constituency, as many of you might know, stipulates 3 seats as the smallest number permitted, but it does not set any maximum number. There's no reason why average constituency size could not be larger. So the constituency sets 3 seats as the minimum, and another thing it says is that the ratio of population to TDs should be the same right across the country, so that avoids any government doing, not that any government would really think of doing such a thing, but giving more seats to areas of the country where it's stronger, as sadly did happen back in the 1960s. So when we go to vote, that's an example of a ballot paper. It's all much too small for any of you to read. But anyway, most of you will have voted and have seen a ballot paper. So as we know, it lists all the candidates in alphabetical order. They're not grouped by party or anything like that. And many parties will run more than one candidate. So that one there is actually from Cavan Monaghan at the 2002 election, and in that constituency, both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil put forward 3 candidates. But voters are not in any way constrained by party lines. Voters simply rank all, or as many as they want, of the candidates in order of their preference. And the voters rank the candidates on the basis of any factor that's important to them. What factors might that be? Well, for most voters, that's still party. This is not as true as it used to be. In the past, the great majority of voters did seem to think in party terms. It's still true that most voters think in party terms. So that's to say, if someone gives their first preference to a Fine Gael candidate, the likelihood they'll give their second preference to another Fine Gael candidate, and so on. But the number of voters who do that is declining, though it's still true for most voters. But it could be something else. Voters might think in terms of ability, for example. I think the most able candidate on the ballot paper is her. I'm going to give her my number 1 preference. The second most able person who would be good for Parliament is him, even though he's from a different party and a different constituency. Some people will simply think in those terms of the best candidates. Locality, as we know, many voters do think in those terms. We see that particularly in 2 county constituencies, such as Laois Offaly. There are some voters from Laois who want a Laois person, regardless of party. People from Offaly want an Offaly person. If that's the way they think, PRSTV facilitates them in giving expression to those preferences. Gender, it could be. People might want more women in Parliament, might have a tendency to vote for female candidates across party. It could be policy stance, something that cuts across party lines, such as European integration or abortion, for example. Some voters might vote for all the candidates who share their stance on that issue, regardless of party or anything else. So it's up to each individual voter to decide on what basis they award their allocations. So for better or for worse, and we'll come back to that question in the afternoon, for better or for worse, this does give a lot of power to the voters. And it does mean that every candidate is competing against every other candidate, and that includes other candidates of their own party. Every candidate is competing against candidates from other parties, but also, and maybe especially in some cases, candidates from their own party. So voting for voters is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, as they say in countries where they adopt this and have to publicize it. They say it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Counting the votes is less straightforward. And arguably, voters don't need to know the details of how the votes are counted and how a result is delivered, in much the same way as if you buy a new television. You need to know how to control it and how to get what you want out of it, but you don't need someone to come along and explain exactly how every component inside the television works. In a similar way, people probably should be assured that the system is delivering the kind of results they want from it, or the kind of results it's supposed to deliver, but maybe it's not essential that they understand every last detail of how a 4th count surplus is distributed. But basically speaking anyway, the counting process revolves around the quota, a familiar term to many people, and that's calculated by that formula: votes divided by seats plus 1. So to flesh that out with an example, suppose we've got a constituency with 60,000 votes and 4 seats. What's the quota going to be? Well, we add 1 to that 4, giving us 5. We divide 60,000 by 5, which gives 12,000. We add 1 to the result, giving us 12,001. So that's the way the quota is calculated. And as most people will know who've ever followed an STV count, the whole counting process revolves around the quota. Candidates reaching the quota are deemed elected there and then. Almost always on the first count, we don't have the requisite number of candidates elected, so then we get into the transferable part of the system. The transferring of votes comes into play. It's very rare. I think it's about 60 years since the last time the requisite number of people were elected on the first count. So I'm going to go into now the ways in which votes are transferred. If I was to explain this thoroughly, it would take another half hour, so I'll just go over it briefly. But if it's too brief, well, there are either further questions or reading matter to flesh that out. But broadly speaking, anyway, there are two types of vote transfer. One is transfers of votes from candidates who have exceeded the quota, and they're deemed to have a surplus. So, for example, if the quota was 12,001, as in that example, one candidate won 20,000 votes, well, they've got a surplus of almost 8,000. They're surplus votes, and those votes are transferred on to other candidates in accordance with the second preference marked. So in effect, the returning officer is going back to those voters and saying to them, look, as it turned out, that candidate didn't need as many votes as they got. They only needed 12,001. They got 20,000, rather than have nearly 8,000 of you waste your vote by having cast it for someone who didn't need it. Tell me who you would like to benefit from it instead. And the vote can then be transferred on to another candidate. So this avoids votes being wasted for someone by having been cast for someone who turned out not to need those votes. So that's the distribution of surpluses, and the technicalities can be a bit complicated. We won't go into those. The other kind of vote transfers come from transfers of votes from the lowest placed candidates. These are people who, in the rather ominous phrase, are described as being eliminated from the count. Their votes are transferred to other candidates, again in line with the second preference marked. So in effect, those voters are being asked by the returning officer, are being told by the returning officer, look, you cast your vote for a candidate who turned out to have very little support, and they weren't going to be elected. Who would you like to benefit from your vote instead? And the voter indicates that by who they write the number 2 for. So it then gets passed on to the number 2 choice, and maybe later on that number 2 candidate is eliminated, then it passes on to the number 3, and so on. So again, this avoids votes being wasted by having been cast for a losing candidate who couldn't possibly benefit from them. So as we know, under other electoral systems, particularly the British electoral system, a lot of votes are wasted. They're cast for someone who finished third, and voters face a dilemma. Should I vote for someone who I think is going to lose, my favourite candidate who I think is going to be a hopeless loser, or should I vote for one of the leading 2 candidates, the one that I dislike less? Voters are faced with that dilemma under the British system. Under STV, they're not. They can vote sincerely because they know that even if their first choice doesn't do very well, never mind, it can be passed on to the second choice and indeed third choice if need be. So vote transfers do have an impact on the outcome, and we see this in practical terms. That sometimes in a 3-seat constituency, say, a candidate who came only 4th or 5th on first preferences, they rise up on transfers because they receive transfers from eliminated candidates, or maybe from someone the surplus of someone who was elected. Candidates themselves know this, so they don't just pursue first preferences, they look for lower preferences. If we've been canvassed, or if some people in the room have canvassed, they will say, I'd like your first preference, but if you can't do that for me, please remember me, please give me a high preference, please give me your number 2 or your number 3. And voters also know that lower preferences may make a difference. They may not, but they may. You never know that 11th or 12th preference you gave to someone might make all the difference to the electoral, to the outcome of the election. I'll finish really just by looking at the usage of the system. As many people might know, it's not actually a very widely used system. There are only 2 countries that employ this system to elect its lower house of parliament, the main house of parliament, in direct elections. That's this country and Malta. There are other places where it's used in direct elections to elect subsidiary houses. It's used north of the border to elect the Northern Ireland Assembly. In the north, there are more MPs or MLAs per constituency, 6 in each of the 18 constituencies. It's used in Australia to elect the Senate. Things are a little bit different there, and it's used in a number of countries to elect either local government or senates in more restricted elections. The reasons why it's not more widely used, well, partly this is because STV is seen on the continent of Europe as a kind of Anglo version of PR. It's had very limited success in non-English speaking countries. Say a little bit more about that this afternoon, but anyway, the main point here is that STV per se is not very widely used. So having given you that overview of things that most of you probably knew already, I'll finish there and ask David Farrell to tell you about things that you might not already know. Thank you.